So we urgently need to collaborate, to have a collaborative approach, MDBs, PDBs, private banks, because as we said in the morning, if we Zoom and we work together, that's larger than doing it individually. So the public development banks also have a critical role in this process by channeling financing, reducing risk, promoting sustainable projects, and fostering this vital collaboration for enabling our societies to grow and to belong and to provoke these sustainable economies. So with that, now moving to our keynote speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Boitumelo Mosako. She is the CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, where she was appointed CEO in April of this year to lead this prestigious development bank. The Development Bank of Southern Africa has been a cutting-edge regional development bank, particularly in the climate field. We are excited to hear from her about what net zero and a just transition means for Southern Africa. Welcome.
Thank you, Mariel. Thank you, Diana, as well. Thank you to Fix for the opportunity to be here today, to our panel members as well, and colleagues who are listening to the conversation. Welcome. Thank you. The World Economic Forum 2023 Global Risk Report states that the next 10 years, 6 out of the top 10 global risks will be environmentally related. The top 4 envisaged events are failure to mitigate climate change, failure of climate change adaptation, natural disasters and extreme weather events, as well as biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. There is an element of urgency with which the global reduction of emissions must be approached. An important step should be a direct response to the general lack of progress regarding climate change targets. And it has been established that 2 issues are largely responsible for this. Firstly, there's generally a slow follow-through to climate change commitments due to several reasons. Secondly, there's been a significant divergence of both public and private sector resources towards frequent recent crises in recent times, such as disasters and other socio-economic challenges. One thing that we have seen post-COVID as well is the allocation of, resources. And, I was making an example earlier on today on SDGs and NDCs, that it's not either or. It's how we actually do both optimally in a way that drives socio-economic development. DFIs are uniquely positioned to address climate change as they have expertise in project finance, and they have what we call convening power, in terms of the relationships they have with governments, with, various stakeholders, civil society, and private sector. And they are already, mobilizing private investment and concessional risk mitigation instruments such as guarantees, concessional loans to support low and climate resilient projects. Let me give you an example of what we did at DBSA. Using our convening power ourselves and the Department of Minerals and Energy at the time developed what we call the Independent Power Producer Program. Now, that independent power producer program was firstly to create a new generation of electrical power, and that electrical power was purely renewable. This collaboration where we, established a procurement office where it was, clear who the off-taker is going to be, which is our energy entity owned by the government. So there was clarity on policy, there was certainty on offtake, so it created an enabling environment for private sector participation just by having that in place. This resulted in more than 30 billion in US dollars being invested in the Independent Power Producer Program in South Africa. What I'd like to highlight as well is generally we talk about project preparation. the developers invested in project preparation themselves because there was certainty around the whole program. So that is what the convening power that public development finance institution play in leveraging the relationships that it then has. Secondly is, what are those when we look at the just transition, and it has been a topic for the day. Just transition looks different in different places. There's no universal template to be replicated everywhere indiscriminately. We all have our unique challenges. We all have our unique statuses as countries. A just transition is a class issue. Equitable distribution and power relations must be addressed. A just transition, Marlies has already touched on, is a gender issue. Women disproportionately bear the burden of the climate crisis. A just transition is an anti-racist framework. Racial minorities everywhere disproportionately bear environmental costs. And that is something that we definitely have to be aware of. A just transition is more than just climate. Transition is about economic activities being considered within ecosystems at all levels, both locally and global as well. As a development finance institution, we have adopted a net zero statement that aligns, our operations with global and continental and national positions as well. The bank emphasizes transition finance in its strategy position. We have even, created the relevant, frameworks in this regard, including a green building framework that we have adopted as an institution. This emphasis responds to the specific condition of the African continent, where unemployment is high, inequality is prevalent, and poverty is extreme. From this point of view, the just and transition elements are important from a developmental point of view. I cannot emphasize that enough, that they go hand in hand. It is not sufficient to just focus on reducing emissions without coupling that with socio-economic development. We cannot do the just transition without development. They go hand in hand. Now, what are those, mechanisms that are then available for us as development finance institutions to fund the just transition? One of the mechanisms that we have adopted is blended finance. Within the DBSA, we have put in place an investment platform in the form of the Infrastructure South Africa, where it's a place where we can use blended finance, where we take fiscal allocation money to use that into the projects to catalyze private sector funding. On the partner side, we have what we call embedded generation investment program. You are hearing a lot about programs. As an institution, we believe that a programmatic approach to infrastructure development enables, economies of scale and, enhances infrastructure acceleration. With this program, I'll give an example. We have an EIB line with the European Investment Bank, and we actually, blend that facility. It's a 200 million euro facility that we actually, blend to then on-lend to the developers for self-generation projects. Why do we do that? It is important for us to ensure that to allow participation in this process, we are deliberate in actually reducing cost of funds as an institution, and it's important that whatever benefit we get with these concessional lines, we pass on to the people that then borrow the money. That is important for us to also get the scale of participation in the projects as well. I think, and I need to move quickly. Collateralized funding. This is a program where when one has liquidity challenges, they can actually then repo whatever bonds they have to then get access to liquidity. Thirdly, it's concessional green funds. DBSA is accredited to GCF. It's accredited to GEF as well. We have recently received, got allocated $235 million in funds for a water reuse program. What is interesting about this hybrid, because it's 235, the 200 is going to go directly to projects. The 35 is specifically for project preparation. And that's a key, important part of it as well. Because just as much as we can say, there's capital, but there must be bankable projects that we as an institution develop and make available to the market. And in that way, when we have bankable projects, de-risks, it then enables private sector participation. I've then, touched on project preparation as well. So, other finance and de-risking tools for sustainable infrastructure projects such as PPPs, guarantee, standard loans are essential to attract investments and ensure project viability and, mitigate potential risks. They create an enabling environment for successful implementation. So we are saying by harnessing innovative and effective financing and de-risking tools coupled with strategic collaborations, we as public development banks have the potential to transform the development finance landscape and consequently economies and contribute significantly to global sustainable development goals and climate goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this interesting reflection. Now we will continue with the panel, and I'm happy to pass the floor to Diana Smallridge, CEO of newly named Momentus Global, as our moderator. Since 2000, when she founded International Financial Consulting Limited, as it has been called until this week, she and her team have been active in the development and climate space. So we're happy to have her facilitate this excellent panel of speakers and contributors. Thank you. Diane?
Thank you very much, Maricela Boitamelo. It's a pleasure and honor to be moderating this panel. And we've divided this up into two sections. We want to have some scene setters. So we have three of our panelists who are going to give some strategic overview about the net zero concepts. Then we have a group of fantastic implementers who are actually doing operational implementation of net zero plans. So in the interest of time, because we have a speaker who is being desperately waited for on panel 2 and who kindly offered to split his time between us, and really who's the only one in the entire however many people are in this conference with net zero in his company, in his organization's name. I'm very happy to introduce Alan Gomez, who leads the Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero for Latin America, to say a few words about GFANZ and what it means to be at FIX for GFANZ.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So again, as I did it this morning, I hope you can forgive me because I'm going to speak in Spanish this time. So vamos a cambiar.
So we're gonna switch. And the truth is that once again, it's a pleasure. Thank you for this space, and thank you for adjusting the agenda as well for Fix and Diana and Live Invest team. I would like to talk about the transition programs, and in particular, what is it that we do in GFANZ? We need to remember that the size of the challenge that we have worldwide right now, since we're running out of time from here to 2030, with regards to what the IPCC states, we require a large transformation of the economic system and all of our energy systems. More than 90% of the countries, 90% of the world GDP reflected in countries already has net zero commitments. And these are starting to create policies, so evidently they are according to this commitment. So in this sense, the clearer the policy is, definitely the clearer the transition is and more organized it can be as well. So this is significant, evidently, for the risk that it represents for financial institutions and to the real economy, that they are not really incorporating these topics or this path towards the transition in their business strategies. That's why G-Funds is created. The Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero is a global coalition which encompasses all the financing chain which is committed with net zero. So we're talking from banks, asset owners, asset managers, insurers, financial services companies, venture capital, for example, as well. All of them have an alliance for net zero. As of today, when we add up all these alliances, all this value chain, we're talking about more than 650 organizations which are committed to net zero. And we are talking about more than 130 trillion or $1 billion in financed assets. G-Funds, what it does is that it helps coordinate all the work that is within this private financial sector. We develop common methodologies, we develop frameworks which allow us to deliver the net zero commitments, including also the creation of a global architecture that allows us to mobilize the capital for the emerging markets. Now, what we do with the multilateral banks and what we promote is to create commitments at the country level which have programmatic focuses, which can be to be able to scale initiatives to accelerate the pipelines and the amount of projects that you need to have when these commitments are undertaken, and of course promote the coordination between public entities and the private sector. And I don't know if we should stop here, or you tell me.
We're delighted to have you, but we know you have to run across the hall. Let me then take a moment to move to our next scene setter. I'm looking at you, Asger Garnick with Concito, a Danish think tank. And Asger has done a lot of thinking about net zero as the investment and finance lead at Concito. So, Asger, we're just very keen to hear your overview of how you see the issue for public development banks.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and actually I have a history with the Inter-American Development Bank, and also there we did development of innovative finance instruments already at that time, and energy savings insurance instruments. So I'm very familiar with and happy about all of the innovation work going on. But my role here is more to take a step back and look at some of the high-level challenges that we are facing in the public development bank community. Before we start about tools, let's take a look at the scale of investment needed and the financing challenge, and the role and functions of public development banks in the international and national systems. So the challenge, I think it was mentioned in the opening plenary, there's a need for $2.4 trillion of investments per year going into emerging and developing countries beyond China. And that's a quadrupling of the current levels. And it amounts to 6.5% of GDP by 2030. Private international finance has to be a big part of it. GFANS is supposed to help with that. It's going to increase from 100 billion to 600 billion per year. Domestic resource mobilization is, of course, a core element of National Development Bank activity. The scale there is also impressive. That financing source is going to supposed to increase from 400 billion to 1,400 billion per year in order to live up to the investment needs for development and climate. So the 2.4 trillion, that is really things related to the energy sector transition, nature conservation, agriculture, adaptation and resilience. So it's a core. These are core elements of an SDG-aligned agenda. There are also more investments in other areas on top of that that are part of the SDG investment challenge. And the underlying message is this can only happen in an integrated fashion, as it was said just before. Development and climate has to be attacked at the same time. There's no story, there's no approach where we do development first and then at some point in the future we just address climate. That is not going to be feasible because that will bring climate disaster. That is going to undermine economies already. So it's a different ballgame for the public development banks going forward, and that's basically the main message of my intervention here. Public development banks need to do more to scale up in line with the investment challenge. They need to do different with a lot stronger focus on mobilizing and catalyzing finance from other sources than their own balance sheets. And of course, they need to do greener as well. And I just want to take a look at the NDBs and the public development banks within the systems that they are active in. And we heard a very good point about the enabling policy and regulatory conditions that are essential, for example, in the energy sector, in order to attract investment and finance. That is absolutely important, that you have concerted action at in the real economy sectors that develop pipelines of investment opportunities. The AFD, also in the plenary, AFD CEO Remy Rioux said that NDBs need to do more on the origination side of things. On the finance side, it's obvious that public development banks play an important role in terms of putting in place the instruments, the vehicles, and contributing to the financial regulation that is needed. Capital market development is an important part of domestic resource mobilization. Developing bonds markets, both corporate and municipal. Offloading assets by originating to distribute models. In many ways, attracting domestic capital and make it invest in productive assets within the country. There's also a third tier in addition to the real economy and the finance sector, and that's a whole macroeconomic story and the cross-cutting story. You cannot have this investment push and this huge amount of funding being mobilized without having economies that function efficiently on a macro and cross-cutting basis. You have to have tax collection, you have to remove fossil fuel subsidies and have green taxation put in place in order to create the fiscal space and in order to create incentives for the investments in the green economy. Public development banks, also the national ones, they are also key in providing a connection to the international system. They function as intermediaries between the international financial institutions. At the country level, that is often happening or increasingly happening through country platforms that are being established, for example, as part of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which is also happening in South Africa, Indonesia, and other places. And they engage with MDBs and with institutional investors in the international arena, basically the GE Funds membership. So NDBs, public development banks and national ones in particular, are important intermediaries between public and private and between national and international. So in terms of the functions that public development banks perform, it's clear that there is a wide variety of functions here that range all the way from the national planning and policy level to creation of pipelines of investable opportunities, risk mitigation, development of vehicles and instruments that can channel private finance from both domestic and national sources, and engagement with the finance ministries and the international financial community. There are some questions that are also will have to be addressed in this renewed vision of what the public development banks have to do, including the national development banks as well. The overall business model and the funding models, they're being challenged potentially. There was a previous session where Marcus Bernd from EIB said, if development banks only focus on mobilization, what is then going to be their source of revenue going forward? Because if they don't even hold assets or offload them very quickly, they could potentially lose their main source of revenue. So how are they then going to fund all of their project development and market development activities? These are questions that are being asked. There's an OECD study coming out, I think it's actually next week, on how the funding models of different DFIs as one category of public development banks impact their ability to deliver on their missions. There's of course also the whole issue of incentives at the institutional level, but also at the individual level of the employees of public development banks, because there is again a system of incentives that is focused around the direct financing by the institution itself. And I'm aware that the Development Bank of South Africa has actually worked on some of these issues because of the very ambitious mobilization targets that have been set. It is a challenge to adopt internal models and incentives and KPIs that support this. I think this is by way of a high-level overview. Of course, we're going to have much more interesting interventions about the specific risk mitigation that is going on at the project level. There's also work increasingly on risks that address the macro level, such as currency risk. And across all of this, there is an issue of capacity and investment in human and institutional resources, which is going to be essential going forward. And I know that that is one of the things that the Inter-American Development Bank, for example, has done a lot about in its cooperation with national development banks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asger. One of the points you mentioned was among many very salient points, the role of a national development bank in terms of its interactions with the Ministry of Finance and other ministries, and how important it is for these institutions to feel really part of the policy dialogue. I see one of our panelists nodding. So I'm really happy to introduce Rodolfo Bustamante with the Ministry of Finance of Chile to give us a sense of what your government, when you make a commitment to net zero, what does that mean, and what does that mean for your instrument like Corfo?
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, everyone. I'm here as a representative of the presidency of the Regional LAC Platform for Finance Ministers for Climate Change. By now, I will talk as my role of economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance and having relationship, as you said, with our local agency for development, Corfo, and IFIS. Chile is actively committed to climate action and net zero. And so I would like to contribute with the following. Our new framework law on climate change that came into effect by June 2022 states that a financial strategy for climate change must contain the main guidelines for orienting the contributions of public and private sector towards the consolidation of a greenhouse gas neutral and climate resilient development. Taking into account considerations that the guidelines, objectives, and goals included in the long-term climate strategy, or NDC. So it has to be Paris aligned. This strategy must be prepared for us every 5 years. So, for instance, we will innovate this year by integrating financial strategy for biodiversity that is aligned with our commitments made in COP15. Also, Chile is currently working in implementing a fiscal framework for climate change, which includes pre-allocating resources for climate initiatives in our public budget law. We're doing that with the UNPD. Last year, for instance, also we established a natural capital committee. This body will have the mission of advising and proposing actions to the President of the Republic concerning matters related to the measurement, valuation, protection, and restoration for Chile's natural capital. Also, with the aim of promoting the alignment of investment towards environmental sustainable activities, Chile is in the process of creating taxonomy, as Colombia did recently. These systems will allow for the objective, credible, and science-based determinations of which activities, projects, and investments are considered environmentally sustainable. Regarding your question, I'm sorry. Today the Ministry of Finance has the presidency of the regional platform with the help of IDB. This platform, which aim to be a knowledge-sharing space for the formulation of fiscal policies to address the consequences of climate change, was initiated by the Ministry of Finance of Chile and the help of development banks. This initiative has the objective to address the capacities and knowledge in each country's fostering South-South regional vision. Lastly, Chile has Corfo, that is our Corporation for the Promotion and Production. Is a government agency that focuses on promoting economic development and investment in the country. Although it's not a traditional development bank, it shares some similarities with a public development bank. One of the key areas where Corfo excels is in the development of financing instruments to boost innovative strategies, such as green hydrogen. We have a new boosting in the green hydrogen industry that was launched this year. Additionally, it plays a significant role in creating tax incentives for innovation and development, as well as supporting small and medium-sized enterprise. Corfo has also collaborated closely with multilateral development banks on various projects, underscoring its role as supportive entity for economic and technological development in Chile. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodolfo. So I now want to move to the tools, the people who are actually implementing these ideas. And we're going to start with Isaac Godoy from AFD Uruguay, not AFD France, but Paraguay, pardon me. Yes, he's the board member, managing director of AFD, to give us their experience in this area. Thank you.
Sí, muy buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por la invitación, por esta oportunidad de estar con ustedes. Bueno, la AFD es la Agencia Financiera de Desarrollo, el banco de segundo piso del Paraguay, un banco que tiene una cartera de casi 1.000 millones de dólares. Esa cartera está colocada en un 47% en el sector vivienda y el otro segmento, el 53% en diversos sectores de la economía. Es una agencia que en los últimos 3 años.
The agency during the last 2 years has strengthened from the regulatory standpoint and of its roles as well, because we manage the guarantees of Paraguay. Especially AFD during these last years has entered several different spaces, and what I'm going to speak about is the opportunity we have of being part of different spaces of articulation and coordination between public agencies within the framework of designing long-term public policies for Paraguay. Even though this could be like an anecdote, we know that coordinating the public institutions and to have let's say, coincide in some aspects and think in the medium term is not easy. In the plenary room, we were highlighting that one of our greatest challenges is to coordinate, and if that could be done with a counterpart from the private sector, that would be extremely important. Paraguay, during the last 10 years, has had a very important link with Brazil. The industrial supply chain between Paraguay and Brazil is increasingly interconnecting. When we looked at the challenge of going forward in some of the electric mobility programs, we said, well, why don't we think that Paraguay might become an industrial platform, thinking in Mercosur as its market. And so Paraguay can go forward towards structuring a platform that would allow to assemble in the country electrical vehicles to start to have an influence on the fleet in Paraguay. And why not to be a platform that is part of the supply chain in Mercosur, so that we can industrialize electrical vehicles. Within the framework of cooperation with the private sector, in Paraguay during the last few years, we've had the most important or the most significant private investment of history, and it was done in the forestry sector. Our challenge is to go forward in forestry projects on an area of 200,000 hectares in the north of the country on the border with Brazil. And this has led us to initiate and structure for the first time with the private sector and with the different companies of investors a first fund of $100 million to start working on the first forestry projects of the country. And the third item that I'd like to mention is the progress we're doing in the support to SMEs, to industrial SMEs, to improve their energy efficiency. These three challenges that we have are done in the private and public articulation sectors and within the framework of the National Council of Economic Development. And the new government that just took office 2 weeks ago, all of these programs will consolidate and, of course, will be materialized in the short term as the Finance Development Agency to be part of the design of the public policy, where the financing of development is part of the design of the intervention. I think it's a very interesting experience we can share with you. Thank you very much.
All countries, and certainly those in Latin America, is very important. And I got quite excited at introducing the next panelist, because as we move down the chain from the strategy people in government to giving mandates to the national instruments like the National Development Bank, who provides financing, then you have the real economy. And we have the real economy here. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Jean-François Joachim, who works in the e-mobility space here in Colombia, and can offer a really hopeful perspective on how such implementation of these projects can happen. So over to you, Jean-François.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Marisela, and everyone for having us. So by way of background, VG Mobility is a company that is dedicated to developing and investing in e-mobility solutions. We'll get into that. We've been operating in Colombia since 2021. We have regional presence from the US to Chile, including Brazil. And we expect to deploy about $1 billion in the region just in e-mobility platforms in the next 4 to 5 years. Today we have 4 operations running. We have 3 in Bogota. So we also had 2 weeks of not running cars in Bogota with 406 buses in operation in 3 different operations. And we now have an additional 40 buses operating in the city of Antofagasta in Chile. So we are the first international investors getting into the regions in Chile, and we expect to grow and commit in that country going forward. I think before getting into what needs to happen for e-mobility to work, I think we first need to break a bias that there is around infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure, everybody's happy because it's non-rolling infrastructure. We're used to dams, we're used to wind farms, we're used to solar farms, which is something that is relatively easy to measure because it's always there, it's standing, it's still. It's not a standstill for the banks, but it's standing and it's still. It doesn't move, which from a public development bank and government assessment is very simple because it doesn't move. Mobility has a completely different angle, which is that it is infrastructure, but it moves. And just from that perspective, it becomes a challenge because all the systems are today geared towards things that don't move. We'll talk about it a bit later, but when development banks move into e-mobility, they will first need to understand that the risk is different because this moves. And that's pretty important. The second thing is, how do we understand e-mobility? When everybody talks about e-mobility, the first thing we think about is the bus, the car, the taxi, the moped, whatever we see around that moves. But actually, it's a combination of a number of things, and that's what VG Mobility specializes on, is making sure that we have actually sustainable solutions, sustainable not only because they reduce emissions, but also because they work. Because when we implement something new, we need to make sure that it works beyond the asset itself. And that's where many of the e-mobility initiatives have fallen through, because we have only been thinking about putting buses at work and not putting together a whole ecosystem that makes it work. And the magic number for that ecosystem from our standpoint is 6. Why 6? Because it's a chain of 6 things that need to work in order to make any e-mobility project work. Starting with the obvious, the vehicle. The second obvious, which is the charging infrastructure. The third, not that obvious, but kind of obvious, which is the space, the depot, where everything is going to be charged and parked. The fourth, which is the chargers themselves, what they're going to do. A lot of people talk about that. But there are 2 things which are the real bottleneck in all this. The first thing is electricity, make it that number 5. If there is no electricity, there is no e-mobility. And that's something that I want to make clear here. E-mobility is not about having enough vehicles. It is about having enough power. The good thing is that technology is evolving so that everything is moving to using less energy. So there is electricity spare capacity, but we need to make sure that that spare capacity is actually driven where it needs to be. To give you an example, and I think for all of you who are new to e-mobility, in the most orthodox way, 100 buses need 5 megawatts of power. 5 megawatts of power in Latin America is about a city of 200,000 to 300,000 people in terms of electricity demand. So sizing the energy becomes very important in those 6 pillars that we mentioned, and the last one is data. The more data we gather, the more the technology is going to evolve, and the more the cost is going to evolve as well. Because at the beginning, when we're trying to implement these new technologies, of course, we're being very defensive. We are asking for a lot of technological requirements to make sure that the technology works and that people get comfortable with the technology. But as the technology evolves, it will become cheaper and cheaper, not only from the operational standpoint, but also because we will be able to take some risks that at this stage we are not willing to take. And just to give you some ideas about the impact of e-mobility, which is the least glamorous of the infrastructure investments. Why? Because it moves, and it's not standstill, as most of the infrastructure investments. When you see a bus, you need to take into account a few things, and I think that a few people around the room know about these numbers. 1 bus equals 2.5 drivers. 2.5 drivers equals 1 person behind doing the maintenance and the admin job. In Latin America only, we have around 60,000 buses. So if we do the math, the impact that this can have in greenhouse emissions and in all the SDG goals are about 60,000 buses, 150,000 drivers, 30,000 admin and support people that are just around this industry, and each driver has an average 3 people in charge. So imagine just what e-mobility can do with what we call a single bus. And if you add that, you can probably multiply it by 2 or 2.5 if we include Africa. If we go to Asia, I think we can multiply it by another 2 to 3. So we are talking about a market that in the next few years, I've heard a lot of trillions here. I'm going to be a bit more modest. It's not trillions, it's billions. But it's something where in the next 10 to 15 years, if we want to shift to e-mobility, it's going to require at least $30 to $40 billion of investment, which are a combination of investment in infrastructure that is steel, but it's the cheapest, that is charging infrastructure, together with rolling infrastructure.
Thank you, Jean-François. What's so interesting just in your last remarks is hearing the metrics. If you're talking about what Boitumelo is saying, we can't avoid SDGs and NDCs. This is both. You are actually counting your good jobs and you're counting GHG reduction. And so it's such an important perspective you're bringing. E-mobility is only one pathway to net zero. This panel is also wanting to explore the just energy transition, which we also spoke about earlier, and making sure that it doesn't have negative impact on development. But just energy transition is something that's really important, and the energy transition more generally. Johan Schuh from Proparco, the French DFI, I know, Johan, you've been doing a lot in energy transition, supporting the energy industry here in Latin America and, of course, globally. So we'd love to hear some words from you about what Proparco sees as the opportunity.
Thanks, Diana, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, Proparco is the private sector arm of the French Development Bank. So I will speak as a AFD group person. AFD being dedicated to private sector, not AFD Paraguay, Isaac, is the French one. So I think that inside the group we've set up quite ambitious targets since 2017 after the Paris agreements, and we've adopted 2 pillars at that date to be better in terms of energy transition. The first one was to make sure that 100% of the projects that we finance are aligned with the Paris Agreement on climate change. That is to say, not to finance any project that would make a country derive from its NDC, and more than that, check that a project is compliant with the nationally defined contribution of a country. And the second pillar was to systematically measure the carbon footprint of the projects that we finance, and as a group level to commit that 50% of what we do would have climate co-benefits, which is, I think, quite an ambitious and difficult target to reach every year. To give you a few figures, last year we've committed 4.7 billion euros for climate mitigations projects, so the one that contribute to the reduction of CO2 emissions, and this is 70% more than the volumes we committed back in 2017. So I think that it's a significant effort, and I think that this is something that is shared by other development banks. We've almost all of us have almost duplicate our commitments in that respect. Since 2017, it's 33 billion committed for CO2 reduction projects. So for that, we use a lot of different tools. I think that a lot of them have been mentioned today, but blended finance is one. Every year, the French government gives us approximately 2 billion euros to blend our financing, either with subsidies or with interest rate reductions for the project. So that's a significant amount of money for us. Of course, sustainability-linked loans. So to be able to reduce the interest rate of loans when some targets in terms of CO2 reductions are met. This is something that we've been putting in place and that we still want to do. Green bonds, of course, but also dedicated credit lines for banks, which represent 40-45% of what we do, where the bank commits to lend the money that we provide to them for sustainable projects, but with a quite strict taxonomy to be sure that we are not greenwashing. And it's important. So I think that that's the type of things that we do. Electric mobility is a very good point. I mean, we are active in terms of renewable energy. We provide long-term loans, 17, 20 years, not 20,000, 20 years, which I mean shows a commitment to support those kind of projects. And in terms of electric mobility, I think that what has been said by Marisela and by Jean-François was quite a good example of what can be done when everyone's on board. Electric mobility requires development banks to be there, but also a city, a national government that is supportive, because of course, I mean the commercial price of the bus tickets that the people pay is not paying for the service that they receive. So if the city is not there, if the local government is not here to match the difference, then there's no project. So we also have financed buses in Bogota last year, in 2021 as well, with our good local partner FDN, the Colombian Development Bank, which also receives a loan from our mother company, the AFD. So it's really a team effort in that respect.
Excellent. Thank you, Johan. And the other, I think, relevant topic to net zero is around the circular economy. And I'm really happy to invite actually our host of this incredible event, Bancoldex, Jose Naranjo, who is VP of Strategy. I know Bancoldex is, in your day job, is doing an awful lot around the circular economy. And that's such an important dimension of this. So we'd love to hear a little bit from you about that.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Marisela, for this wonderful invitation, for having us here, and for let us participate in this very interesting conversation. So let me talk a little bit more about Bancoldex. Bancoldex is the Business Development Bank of Colombia. And what we do is we offer financial and non-financial services to SMEs from all kinds of sectors except agricultural. And we do that from second tier, like a rediscount scheme. And recently we can go straight, and we can we can offer them directly loans. And this is very recent. And we do that only for small and medium-sized enterprises, not micro enterprises. So this is important because we try to have a very keen portfolio, understanding their needs. And therefore, we've been designing a sustainable strategy, which is aligned with the corporate strategy. And especially as far as the circular economy, we think that help SMEs to adopt new models and circular economy models could be a tipping point for them to help them have cleaner processes. So that is very important. We think it's about giving them the right incentive to dip in new kind of sectors, new kind of activities, new kind of processes. So that is the first point. Right incentive, give to the right enterprises. Then let me share with you two successful credit lines, instruments. We've been designing in the bank, and it's very important to point out that it's under the blending finance scheme. We find that very successful, and I think for public-private banks, it's very important to have that scheme going on as far as possible. The first example is a credit line we called Sostenible Adelante, which means sustainable forward, and is specially designed with resources coming from a third party, and in this case, from the trade minister. And when you said that strong relationship with our ministers are important, well, this is a perfect example. We have to have strong relationship with our stakeholders. In this case, this special credit line called Sostenible Adelante is focused, of course, on energy efficiency, sustainable transportation, and of course, circular economy, among others, but specifically circular economy. And we have, in this credit line, two components. The first one is financial credit line, and the other one is technical assistance. Because, and you said it earlier, SMEs don't have the capability to structure their process, their project. So we have to help them, and we have to give them technical assistance, especially in new topics, new schemes like circular economy. So we're trying to give them the knowledge to help them to grow in that path. And the other example we set up with a third party was a credit line we designed with a German corporation and with specially funds coming from Mitigation Action Facility only for SMEs belonging to the sector, to the refrigerator sector. So that is another example of special credit lines, especially blending finance, and we had really nice results. And let me finishing by say that I have maybe two interesting conclusions of that. We've been living with that two credit lines. The first one is public development banks. Of course, we need strategic partners. We can't do it alone. We need cooperation, international and national cooperation. We need strong relationships with our stakeholders, because finally, what we are is a public policy instrument. So we have to help SMEs to fulfill their needs and to understand the gaps in the market. I would finish there, and finally, and all these, I think, regroup a feeling that everybody has here is innovation has to be behind all the instruments, all the companies, all the special agencies that design every day for SMEs and for circular economy to happen and to make cleaner processes.
Thank you, Maria Jose. So no shortages of challenges in this area, no shortage of stakeholders to align and bring together. I wanted to put out a question to the panel. I might start with Asger, and I think others may have something to say about this, but there's this pressing need for finance and mobilizing private finance. And we've got a couple of banks here on the panel who are second tier, meaning mostly doing indirect as a wholesale bank. In that case, less likely to be competitive with the private sector. So the issue I wanted to raise and put to you in your strategic perspective, the dangers of crowding out, having a development bank just going in because of the urgency that we have with achieving net zero. How do you see that issue? Do you see it, Asger, as something that we should care about? Here's Bangladesh saying that they're now going directly. How do we, as a sort of a policy angle think about competition between public and private, or maybe it doesn't matter?
Yeah, thanks for that that question. There's a lot of complexity if you dig into that. Of course, it's the public development banks. They have an advantage in being funded by their government. They have therefore strong credibility in the market, and they are able to finance investments at it doesn't have to be concessional. It's even, you could term it as favorable but non-concessional terms. So it's not like they are as such subsidized, but they are, because they are of their relatively high creditworthiness, they are often able to finance at a relatively low interest rate, giving projects access to finance at a low cost of capital compared to purely commercial investments. And that's, of course, an attractive proposition. And from a developing country perspective, it's of course also very attractive to have investments financed that come at a low cost of capital, in particular clean technology investments that are capital intensive, where a lot of the cost actually depends on the cost of capital. So in that sense, who can be against a low cost of capital, regardless of the source of that? And that's definitely true. The thing is that we need scale. I tried to make it very clear that we really need to scale up the aggregate level of finance. And there's no MDB or National Development Bank that is able to cover this need for increased levels of capital from their own balance sheets. That's simply not possible. So that's why catalyzing other sources of finance is going to be essential going forward. And if you, so you could say it's direct finance from a public financial institution can help reduce cost of capital for important investments. That's good. But it has to be done for the right reasons and with the right strategic perspective. It has to be part of a market development where you have a strategy for how do you catalyze other sources of finance. I was in another session earlier today where it was clear that there is an incentive, an inherent incentive on the part of a public development bank to just, it was said directly, basically crowd out private finance, because then you have a good investment on your books that generates revenue for your institution, and that makes for an easier life. And often incentives within institutions are designed like that to encourage that. And that's a way of crowding out private finance for the wrong reason, even though at the individual project level it's of course nice because you have a higher share of public finance, which means basically other things equal that you have a lower cost of capital for that particular project. But in terms of the systemic transformation and getting to scale, you're sort of undermining the objective. That was a long-winded explanation.
I think in this instance, size matters, the size of the project. And I'm really happy to pass the floor over to David Albertani, who is CEO of Catalytic Finance Foundation, who's tackling this issue of size and the role of NDBs and MDBs in that sense quite head on. So David, really pleased to hear some of your perspectives on this question.
Sure, thank you. So thanks for the invitation, and thanks for FIX for organizing this summit. And I think it's a perfect transition because, you know, coming to this panel, everyone believes every single DFI and MDB activity is blended, and you know it seems, you know, listening to today's discussion that that's the main tool. But actually, when people start digging, we see that there are numerous examples of blended finance transaction that has worked, but actually not that much. And there is always a question, why that? And as soon as anyone who has started to do transaction into blended finance, there is definitively difficult question about additionality. Why are you giving that much concessionality? Should you? And all those strategic discussion that Asger just mentioned. So in the end, what you will see is that there are not that many transactions, and sometimes it's more very large and few transactions because given the cost of transaction, you would go for a blending for a very, very large project. And so definitively today, what we feel, and this is, even in our name, Catalytic Finance Foundation, is how can we create a really product to build investment vehicle and standardize schemes and funds or platform to deal with this type of blending. And so actually, historically, we started doing project development as a foundation. We developed a few infrastructure projects in waste, energy sector. And it's really when we get into the financing that we spend maybe 5 years, 4 years to reach each financial close. And this was way too long. And we started really building our own investment vehicle. The first one is called the Subnational Climate Fund. It's an investment fund that exists today. It's a $750 million US investment fund that invests in equity for sustainable infrastructure in the global south. And it took us quite a while, but we managed to secure $150 million of concessional capital, a first loss from the Green Climate Fund, and additionally 18.5 million of grant for a technical assistance facility. And this is typically a type of model that has been proven effective. It's still, we've been running this fund for now 3 years. There are a few transactions. There is capital that has been deployed, and here we already have a few lessons learned. And the first one, I think, in every single activity we do is always to have a large technical assistance. There, each MDB, DFIs you speak to, there is always a need of a technical assistance. So I think in every single vehicle we design, this is really a huge component, and we really believe that first step of blending is definitively having strong project preparations, capacity building facilities to really build the pipeline along investment. And then in the case of the SCF, so the Subnational Climate Fund, the model was a first loss, which has his merit, but also his shortfalls. And so our foundation, based on this first success, we started doing more and more transactions and looking at how we can create blended finance models. So we worked also on the Global Fund for Coral Reef, maybe some of you know it, and a few other mandates that I cannot disclose today because they are still in production. But the latest one is really we received a very large grant last year from the Bloomberg Philanthropies. And with Bloomberg Philanthropies, we are currently working on generating and incubating new financial vehicles, blended model for specific topic and specific geographies, targeted at cities, which is really one of the focus of the Bloomberg Philanthropies Foundation, and to see how we can attract private capital in those type of urban solution. And as I mentioned before, definitively there is, speaking about blending, there is a new technicality that are brought in regarding additionality. Each transaction at some point has some difference, and because additionality becomes so important when speaking about blended finance, we need to create dedicated vehicle for really narrow scope, narrow geographies, and the type of solution that will be a global fund working in 10 sectors and having a first loss from a concessional finance provider usually won't work, because there will be always those questions about additionalities, and deals are not always the same. So today, I think we're working on first losses on the equity side. As I mentioned, technical assistance facilities, so either grant or refundable loan. We are now exploring also guarantees and currency hedging facilities, and I believe all those type of solutions will really grow, and that there is a future for catalytic finance, but again, it's always I'm always glad when you come to FIX, you see everyone speaking about blended finance, but actually there are not that much transaction if you compare to the size of the activities and the balance sheets of the DFIs and the MDBs. So even though there are many positive signs, I still believe that there is a lot to do, and we are not yet there to say that, you know, every single transaction of the MDBs is blended and that the MDBs and the DFI have been crowding in private capital. And this is, you know, at our little scale, what we really try to do. And yeah, so I'm glad to, to bring that to the table.
Thank you, David. I see, Boitemelo, you have your hand up.
Yes, I think I just wanted to add from the last question that you asked around the private sector and the public development banks. What we see is that, you know, the need is so big that, you know, there's a space for everyone. But as a development finance institution, once you've created a market and the private sector can participate, let them, you know, let them participate. But where the opportunity lies is what I'd like to highlight with what we did with the IPP program, and this links in directly with the SDGs, is that with the IPP program, we needed to ensure that as part of this investment program, communities where those projects are going to be implemented are part of the structure. You know, they actually have an element of ownership as well, so that they participate in the green growth economy being created in their space. So for us as DBSA, it was critical that we then support the communities in participating in those structures by, you know, providing, you know, financing instruments for them so that they can then participate. What does that do? The projects gets implemented, there's inclusivity, you know, and in future, you know, there'll be, you know, dividends from those projects as well. So you are minimizing emissions through the implementation of the renewable program, and at the same time, you are enabling inclusivity, you are addressing SDGs as well. So it does work hand in hand, and it's important for us that when we, you know, have these programs, those elements are really at the heart of it. Thank you.
And clearly what's important for development banks, and I often think that running a development bank is not for the faint of heart, because you're not looking just at the commercial return, even just the impact. There is a much bigger role, and I think we've spoken a bit about the development of the pipeline and the upstream work that needs to be done, the TA to, in the circular economy, bring SMEs, educate them, bring knowledge. What do you see as some of the biggest, you know, if you had an unlimited, I'm asked to any one of you, but an unlimited amount of TA money, where would you think it's most effective and highest impact to get these transactions going? Maybe you, Maria Jose.
Thanks. Well, indeed, I think for SMEs, there are several challenges. Financial access and technical assistance are, of course, two of the most important. But I think more than that, there are challenges for SMEs structuring and having technical assistance. But there are big challenges also for us, public development banks, commercial banks, to understand what we have to do. So that means for us designing special credit lines, or better products that understand what are the market failures. If I had a lot of money, I would definitely help them to structure their projects and understand that there are a lot of, not a lot, but there are many sources of different financiation. For example, private equity funds and venture capital funds. they don't know how to go to that kind of financiation. We have to help them, and we have to help also the funds to understand opportunities and to go and to invest in that kind of new sectors. It's a new opportunity, it's a new wave, it's a new trending topic, so we have to be there for them and help them as public development banks and lead the way and give the right signs, the right signal. And finally, also for commercial banks, they have also to maybe enhance their risk assessment and learning how to understand in a better way that kind of project, in particular, circular economy. In conclusion, Diana, there is challenges for all of us as different actors, and I would definitely help SMEs in structure and help them to structure their projects, and of course us as public development banks to understand and to know how to address that topic.
Exactly. Yes, David.
No, yeah, on the technical assistance side, something that we witness because we are running this technical assistance facility too. We see, of course, there are a lot of technical needs, and I think you spoke about it, but also something we really see on the market is a lot of need to support, environmental social impact assessment and environmental social management system. Many projects, in the market will be sound and feasible on a technical point of view, but actually would, sometimes fulfill national requirement for environmental social impact assessment. But when you start dealing with GCF, IFC, money and donors, the criteria are very high. And lots of players out there in the market are not ready for having ESIA, at that level. And I think this is really something, if we look at our technical assistance, I would say half of the technical assistance is on the ESIA or the safeguards to have better safeguards. And today, I think there is a huge gap between sometimes the reality or even the norm in certain countries and what's requested by institutional investors, DFIs, and MDBs.
And Johan, you spoke about a very large sum of money that you get from AFD towards your technical assistance. How do you strategize and know how to allocate that appropriately?
At group level, we have different targets. I think that it also has to do with some political priorities of the French government. It's important, for a bilateral development bank. So most of the money goes to Africa, of course, which is, one of which is the poorest continent where we invest. And then I think that what is important, when we talk about concession, so to reduce the cost of capital of project, to reduce the interest rate that we do, we always make sure that the sponsor will not gain returns that are superior to a normal return for a project. We are very careful to that. If it's for the sponsor to get a 25% return on the project, we'll never reduce the rate. And I think that, as Gerd, you were saying that the cost of capital of some projects don't need concessional money. Well, in those times, with cost of debt at 16% in Colombia, for example, yes, they do. They really do.
Jean-Francois, from your perspective, did you want to answer that? I see you leaning towards... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one fundamental point is there's way too little focus on the technical assistance and capacity building part throughout. And I think you have to take a systems perspective on that. It is, given the challenge that we're facing, it is about systems transformation, and you cannot do that from the project level only. You really need to go all the way up to the overall planning, investment planning, and policy and regulatory frameworks in a country. I think we heard it very nicely from you and the DBSA when you described the green power system, where you said developers do the project development. So it's also very sector specific. If you talk about basically the energy supply sector transformation, you're talking about a scale of investments, but you're also talking about players with the capacity to do project development, provided that the framework conditions around that is in place. So there it's much more around having the auctioning systems and the energy planning and the integration to the power system, the infrastructure in place. And so it's very sector specific, of course. If you're talking about finance that needs to go to an SME through very local financial institutions, you have different layers of technical assistance needs. But I think you always need to go upstream as well and think about how do we make the sector transform. And that's also where you sort of do policy de-risking. You need to do as much as possible there, which will eventually influence the risk perception by the individual economic actors and investors. And then, of course, there'll be, because no system can be perfect, even though you provide support for policy and regulation and all of that. Then you do your blended finance, your specific risk mitigation instruments as sort of to handle residual risk. But I think that should be the approach.
Can I add one thing? No, just that we can have all the money in the world and all the TA money in the world. If there are no projects, it's useless. And I think that we lack of good projects to finance, and not only because it's not ready, but I mean, from my perspective, the projects are really too slow to go out in terms of energy transition. We see projects that were allocated 2-3 years ago and still don't have their environmental license, or still where the concession contracts are not signed or the PPA is not signed. So I think that the national governments should do more as well. They should staff their agencies a bit more to accelerate those projects. They should, I don't know, do one-stop shop for permitting, and there we will be able to finance. Because, I mean, if we all compete for the same projects, yes, we will crowd out the private sector, that's for sure, on some instances. And we all end up doing this, competing with IDB, with IFC, with BNP, with the commercial banks, because we don't have enough projects to finance. And I think that's the key.
Thank you, Johan. And of course, what you say about national governments, and for those of you both in national governments and working with national governments, that may need TA. And that has nothing to do with any of this, but grant money, whether it's through the UN agencies or whatever, to support governments to be able to do the job they need to do and do it well. Jean-Francois, I was going to ask you, and I think ask her, and then I think we're getting close to wrapping up, around policy de-risking, and what would you need to see in place as a project developer in terms of the policy framework?
So I would say that for e-mobility specifically, I would split the answer into two, what we need from the governments and what we need from public development banks. I think from governments, it's, I would say, three things. The first one is electricity capabilities and a very good electrical framework. I think in that case, I would highlight what Chile has done in that sense is very, very good, because regardless of any president in place, there is a very long-term policy to electricity, and there is a lot of transparency in how much the grid connection costs, et cetera, et cetera. And making reference to something that we were discussing with Boitomelo today in the hall is also making sure that we build capacity in advance. In e-mobility, we cannot be reactive. We need to be forward-thinking and anticipate the needs. So I give you some numbers: 100 buses, 5 megawatts. That gives you an idea of what needs to be developed in order to make e-mobility successful. For the governments as well is enabling an environment. Sorry, Boitomelo, I'm taking too many of your quotes, but the enabling environment is very important. Having certainty and a very stable legal framework is key. And I think As Héctor Abad Facio Lince was saying, in Latin America, we have a very stable environment, regardless of many things that can happen. And we're good at doing that, and we can offer examples to the world. And on the PDB side, I would say in e-mobility again, it is understanding that e-mobility infrastructure is a rolling stock. It's not a static stock. That needs a bit of a fine-tuning internally in the risk management tools. I think both IDB and ProParco have done it already, but it's important that it's spread out through the system. The second thing is also knowing who you partner with. I think here we're talking a lot about money and about technical and about assets and about knowledge. But focusing much more on the teams is important, because in the end, the team, even if the project is perfect, is going to be the one that responds to any shortfalls that one can have. And particularly in e-mobility, when things are so new, nobody can come to you and say, I'm the e-mobility expert. I mean, if someone comes to any of you to say that he's the expert on e-mobility, he's lying. Because basically nobody knows what e-mobility is today. And in that sense, if you want as PDBs to support transition to e-mobility, I think it's very important to focus on who you partner with more than the project itself. Because there is only one certainty, is that things are not going to be and perform as they are planned to perform, because this is absolutely new. But we all know that sustainable transportation is key in reaching the SDG goals and the climate goals of Glasgow and all the COPs that we have seen. And the last thing from a PDB standpoint, it is, since this is a new asset class, please be open to uncertainties. I think we want to fit e-mobility into the one-size-fits-all criteria of the classical infrastructure project. Sorry to say this, but again, in e-mobility, there are still many uncertainties, but then partner with the right team in order to mitigate those risks. And the best way to mitigate that risk is by not seeing these projects as corporate finance project, where you can leverage as much as possible and lower the DSCR as much as possible, but by actually asking the sponsor to put more equity at work so that that uncertainty is actually mitigated. And probably I would differ from what Joanne was saying in terms of probably getting 25% is not too much, as long as you put enough money on the table.
Thank you very much, panel. I don't see anyone else asking for the floor, and there's a red sign. Did you want to say one thing? Yes, yes, 2 seconds.
Yeah, so I think we need to scale and reduce the cost of capital for new participants to reduce uncertainty. For instance, state warranties. The facility that Corfo created in Chile for green hydrogens involves the participation of 4 development banks, and more will be added, like 3 more. So allowing for a significant basis point reduction in the cost of capital for green hydrogen projects will boost the industry. That would.
Excellent. Isaac.
Bueno, gracias. Solamente para...
Just to end, we have not mentioned the subject of the loan in the case of the SMEs. We are looking for productive companies, more competitive companies that make investment to reduce emissions, because if we can contribute with the funding, what we are looking for are really 4 companies that could face this investment and could use the investment wisely. From our own perspective, we have to anticipate, to prepare the projects, to reduce red tape that right now is quite heavy, and we need to focus these companies, especially these SMEs that have to gain competitiveness to face this investment. If we talk about public transportation system, in my country, a non-very efficient system with non-efficient companies, we have to solve problem first to be able to invest in transportation that is really complying with these requirements. We have challenges in this area of businesses as well. Thank you.
Well, as we conclude, I just wanted to say thank you for all the insights that you have shared. I wanted to make a list of 6, but it came to 19, so I'm not able to summarize all of the topics and the discussion that we have just had. I think it's important that we recognize that achieving net zero is not a one-size-fits-all. I think that we all share the different perspectives from public development banks, from private sector, from the implementers, and the ones that are bringing also innovation to the different ecosystems. So I think it requires a global effort that take into account the unique challenges that everyone is facing, including the regions, the different communities, and obviously the different sectors that are being part of this ecosystem. I think that maybe I can say 5 instead of 6 and 19 that I had, but I think that the main one are creativity. I think that everyone needs to be creative in the way that face not only net zero, but the different challenges that we're having, the just transition, for example. Coordination, I know it's difficult to coordinate among PDBs and among NDBs, but if we join forces, it will be better and we will scale the impact that we're going to have. Collaboration and contribution are really important to get the things and the impact that we want. And the last one, commitment. If we don't have the commitment to bring all this to work together and to really think about the mission and what we want to achieve in the future, then we're not going to get it. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.
Mucho gusto. ¿Vos estás en el Ministerio de Economía? Sí, gracias. Estoy en Hacienda, no importa. Pero...
Sure. I mean, again, for instance,
sí, a través de ustedes podemos hacer o directo, igual, pero bueno.
the transaction cost is high, but in funds, you cannot, for instance, if